This playlist will collect together and organize the individual component modules, which together will comprise our discussion of classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, and Rome, as we continue to look at ontological frameworks and the synthesis of the concept of the mind. In this particular lecture, we'll be focusing primarily on the process of mental distillation. We noted that all these different properties, from the living, non-living distinction, the animate, inanimate distinction, and the mental, non-mental distinction, were being accreted into this single receptacle, the soul. As we look in classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, and even into the Roman Empire, what we'll see is there are attempts to systematize, to render coherent a notion of the soul that corresponds much more closely to our contemporary notion of the mind. The overall story arc for this lecture will begin with a brief history and geography, where we place this period in history and we look at the individuals that we'll focus on and where, in fact, they were in the Greek and Roman world. Then we'll turn our attention specifically to classical Greek philosophy. We'll look at Plato and we'll look at Aristotle. And what we'll see is that each of them further developed the notion of the soul, rendering it more consistent, more systematic. But we'll also see that each of them end up in a tenuous dualism, where the soul doesn't really fit into the categories that they're using within their ontological framework. It partakes in elements of different categories that cannot possibly be combined. With Plato, it's most clear in that Plato has an ontological substance dualism between the forms and the sensible objects. And as we'll see, the forms and the sensible objects have oppositional properties. They are completely different, and the soul doesn't really fit into either. It's supposed to be part of the sensible realm, and yet it's supposed to somehow partake in the forms. We'll find a similar tension in Aristotle, who talks about form and matter within a monistic, physicalistic framework, but still can't quite figure out how the soul is related to these elements. We'll then finish the lecture by turning our attention to Hellenistic Greece and to the Roman Empire. We'll be focusing only on two ideological developments that occurred during this very long period of time. On the one hand, we'll look at the axiomatization of mathematics and its codification in the volume that is normally attributed to Euclid. And then we'll look at a brief period of about 30 or 40 years when dissection was allowed within Hellenistic Greece, and we saw a tremendous increase, a rediscovery from times of ancient Egypt of knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, which is then frozen almost completely in time, with the exception of Galen, not really increased or understood any farther until we get to the beginnings of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution.